Hi everyone, welcome to my first YouTube video, where I will be teaching you 10 tips and tricks about watercolors. Let me start by telling you that there is no right or wrong way to do watercolors. You can do whichever way you like. I am just sharing the way that I like to do watercolors. Tip number 1 is that watercolors are watery, so that means that you have to be careful where you wet the paper. Unlike oil paint or acrylic paint, watercolor is more likely to drip or spill, so you need to work extra careful. That brings me to tip number 2. Making mistakes. When your paint goes outside your lines, that's not a big deal. Watercolor is very forgiving when you make mistakes. You can easily grab a paper towel and dab away the pigment of the paint. Tip number 3. Evenly spreading the color. Here you can see that I wet the paper first. After all the areas that I want to paint are wet, I go in with the pigment. If the paper is wet enough, you don't have to worry about spreading the color, because the water will do that for you. Tip number 4 is to work in layers. Watercolor is perfect for layering. You can see that I am putting my first wash of color down first. It's all still very light and dulled down. The idea is that you go on with the second layer or even a third layer of watercolors after the first layers dry. Tip number 5 is to pick your own kind of watercolor that you like to use. Here you can see that I use my Faber-Castell watercolor pencils. I like to use these colored pencils because you have more control over how much pigment you use. But there are other types of watercolors. I found that the colored pencils are the most comfortable for me. They are also the most expensive ones. Just because they're expensive and I use them doesn't mean that you have to go out and get them too. Just go out and try some watercolors out there and see which one works for you. Tip number 6. Wet on wet mixing. If you want to create a cool gradient effect, first paint the surface with one color. Then, while the surface is still wet, add the other color. The water will mix the colors for you. Just make sure that when you are mixing colors, don't mix colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel, because the result is mostly like a gray, dulled out, maybe brown color, which is not what you want, unless you're looking for that kind of color. Tip number 7. Make sure that your workspace is organized before you start working. So this means that you have a palette for you to mix your colors on, all the brushes that you want to use, some paper towels in case you make a mistake, and of course a big glass of water. Make sure to refresh your water if it gets dirty, because the dirty water will affect your painting. Tip number 8 is to use good quality watercolor paper. If you are using normal print paper, you will soon realize that it won't work. Because watercolor is made of water, you are literally putting water on your paper, so it will wrinkle up. unless you have good quality watercolor paper. It's special for watercolors, so it will be thicker. You can see here that the red was too dull in the first layer, so I'm going in for the second layer to really bring the character to life. After the red layer has dried, I go in for another shadow layer. Tip number 9 is to use shadows in different colors. So in this painting, for example, I used blues, purples and pinks for shading. You could use blacks and grays for shading, but this will end up making your painting kind of dull. Tip number 10. Use different mediums with your watercolors. You can see me use a black colored pencil, for example, to outline my character. You can even go in with different kind of markers or white gouache paint to highlight certain parts of the painting. Whatever you feel necessary to finish this painting. Or use none at all. It's all up to you, really. I hope you enjoyed spending time with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will be back with another video, hopefully really soon. See you then. Bye!